All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're just a couple minutes before 7. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm a field crops educator down in the southwest corner of the state. I'll be your host for this first virtual breakfast for the season. All right, our first speaker today is going to be Dr. Christy Sprague. She's one of our weed scientists on campus. She's going to talk about early season weed control. So, Christy, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. So today I was thinking of just covering a few topics that we have as we start moving into the season, things that we want to be thinking about for early season weed control. And today what I'd really like to do is talk a little bit about the importance of making sure that we have good weed control early in the season, particularly before we're planting, talk a little bit about some of the options we have. Also want to touch on weed control in winter wheat. We'll be in the next few weeks thinking about that. Just a couple precautions, things to consider. And then finally, as we move into the spring, we've got a lot of cover crops that are out there. So I just want to share a resource that is available out there for termination of different cover crops, and then share a few of our experiences with that. So one of the things that I thought I would do is share a couple of photos that I took a couple days ago going out and scouting some of our fields. These were taken on March 28th, and you can see by looking at this, we've got a lot of winter annuals that are really starting to green up, and with some of the warmer temperatures that I'm sure Jeff will talk about, we're going to start to see some of these weeds really taking off. And when we start thinking about some of the early season weeds that we need to control, a lot of that is going to focus on, you can see from these pictures, common chickweed is going to probably be one of those ones that we're going to have to control, as well as some of the fall mare's tail that came up just this last fall. And you can see on the picture on the left-hand side, you can start to see some henbit. We've also seen some purple dead nettle out there. So in the next few weeks, we're going to start to see these weeds really take off with some of the warmer temperatures that we'll probably be experiencing, as well as some of the moisture. So why is early season weed control important? One of the things we really think about is we want to make sure that we get these weeds controlled before they really start to grow and become a lot more difficult to manage. When we look at little bit later in the season and we start to see some of these winter annual weeds take off, we start to see them flower. A lot of times at that point, it's a little bit harder to control. If we don't control a lot of these early season weeds, some of the things that we encounter is we see some interference with some of our planting and tillage operations. Definitely makes it a lot more tougher to get some of the tillage tools through there, as well as our planters. A couple other things that really creates a competition for that new crop that is planted for moisture, light, and nutrients with some of those germinating crop seeds. And it also can physically interfere with some of the crop emergence. There has been several studies that show that many of these winter annuals can act as alternate host for soybean cyst nematode, and also they can help harbor some of the destructive insects like seed corn maggot. And one of the other things is it definitely causes harder to control weeds. So probably some of you that have been on this, on the virtual breakfast in the past have probably seen a chart that's very similar to this. Really, when we start thinking about early season weed control, whether it's winter annuals or some of those earlier summer annuals that may come up, one of the things that we always worry about is as those weeds are competing with that emerging crop, we often see that that can also impact our yields at the end of the season. So this is looking at soybeans as an example, and looking at controlling some of those early season weeds, either 7 days prior to planting, at planting, when the soybeans up at that unifoliate stage, V1, V3 soybeans, and then not controlling them throughout the season. And by delaying our control of that and allowing those weeds to compete with that emerging soybean crop, you can see if we just wait to the unifoliate stage, many times we can lose as much as 7 bushel per acre. And with that, with today's crop prices, you're basically starting out in the hole. You could lose up to close to $96 per acre by not getting that weed control early in the season. So what do we need to do to make sure that we start out with a good weed-free seed bed? And really what we start to think about is making sure that we start clean. And that can be done with either tillage or a good burn down herbicide treatment. So just a few things to consider when we think of using tillage for weed control, and it makes it a lot more difficult as we start seeing some of the wet weather that might be coming up in the future. One of the things we need to do is, if we're using tillage, is to make sure that we're tilling small weeds, particularly when soil conditions are conducive. We know that if we're tilling when the soil is too wet, it causes compaction. That also causes some issues with planting operations. If we wait until those weeds are too large, they're a lot harder to control. In that case, we may want to put a burn down application on in advance to make sure that we are able to manage some of those larger weeds. Another thing to think about is we're using a lot of vertical tillage tools to prepare seed beds, level out ground. Sometimes those are basically not a very effective tool for removing weeds. So again, if you're using a vertical tillage tool, one potential thing you might want to consider is getting a burn down application out beforehand to make sure that you're controlling those weeds. And then that gives us the opportunity to level out that ground and get our seed bed prepared. Another thing to consider is when we start thinking about some of the weeds that we're trying to control, horseweed is definitely, or mare's tail is one of those ones that we want to make sure that we get good control of. We do know that with some aggressive tillage, we can help bury some of those mare's tail seed or other small seeded weeds, and that can also help reduce some of those weeds that we're dealing with throughout the season. Obviously, the other option we have is if we're in a no-till situation, we really want to look at having a good burn down herbicide program. And what I've done right here is show you some potential options for control for burn down applications prior to planting soybeans. Some of these are very effective also in corn. And this is really focusing on trying to control some of that glyphosate resistant horseweed or mare's tail that we have. The different treatments that I have listed up here are really focusing on making sure that we're getting good adequate control of many of our winter annual weeds and some of those spring annual weeds like common lamb's quarters that'll be coming up pretty soon, but really focusing on trying to get good control of the glyphosate resistant mare's tail that we have out there. And these different examples really focus on trying to make sure that we have an effective site of action out there. We do know that when we're trying to control some of these glyphosate resistant weeds, it's better to have 2 sites of action. So for those of you that are just listening today and can't see the slide, we're really talking about adding things like 2,4-D, for example, 2,4-D ester at a pint plus glyphosate for a good burn down application. And that would give us good control of glyphosate resistant mare's tail as well as many of the other weeds. Or using something like Sharpen at an ounce plus glyphosate and making sure that we have a methylated seed oil in there. Another option that we have that would be a good one effective site of action would be using Liberty at 36 or 43 ounces. With Liberty, we generally will have a little bit less control than what we might have when the temperatures are warmer, but it is an option out there. So again, these would all work for controlling glyphosate resistant horseweed. When we look at some of the combinations, we're really just kind of looking at mixing and matching some of these things like 2,4-D ester plus Sharpen plus glyphosate to help pick up any of those annual bluegrass that might be out there. Sharpen plus Liberty plus metribuzin, giving us some residual as well as some of the burn down application from the metribuzin, and also a combination of gramoxone plus metribuzin. One of those key things to remember is if we are using 2,4-D, unless we have a, especially 2,4-D ester, we need to wait at least 7 days prior to planting. As we look at some of the newer soybean traits, a couple of their options that we have, if we're using an Enlist E3 system, we obviously have the 2,4-D choline salts, the Enlist 1 by itself, or the Enlist Duo, which is the combination with glyphosate. And both of these products work well in an Enlist E3 system. And those can be applied right up to and through planting. And again, just one of the things to think about if you're going to be mixing and matching, and we'll talk about using residual herbicides, to make sure that you check out the approved tank mix website, which is enlist.com/tank mix. Other options, if we're using Roundup Ready to Extend or the Extend Flex soybeans, we obviously can use dicamba for our burn down. We have the Extendamax, Ingenia, and then Tavium, which would be a premixture with S-metolachlor. Again, also, it'll be important to check for the approved tank mixes. The one thing with the dicamba system in those Extend or Extend Flex beans, we do know that we will get some residual control of some of that glyphosate-resistant mare's tail or horseweed that is out there. Another thing that we need to consider when we're looking at starting with early season weed control is when we're doing that, we want to also make sure that we're using a good pre-emergent soil applied herbicide that gives us some residual activity later in the season. And these herbicides are really going to be the foundation program for many of our hard to control and herbicide resistant weeds. By using a pre early in the season, it's going to provide more consistent weed control. It's also going to reduce the number of weeds that are present at the post herbicide application. And it's going to provide more flexibility for our post herbicide applications. And again, remember with these residual pre-herbicides, we can use that after tillage, or we can use that in the burn down treatment. And again, these are going to be very important to help manage some of our more troublesome weeds. And a perfect example of this is looking at good glyphosate resistant horseweed or mare's tail control. The picture that I have posted on here is showing 2 passes of glyphosate, or making sure that we have an effective pre with a residual burn down and following that with a post and having really good control. And that is extremely important also as we look at trying to control things like waterhemp, which has become much more of an issue throughout the state. So making sure that we have an effective pre that reduces those populations so we can come in there with something like a Liberty or an Enlist One in our Enlist systems and make sure that we have good waterhemp control. Now, there are several different pre-herbicides that are available. The MSU Weed Control Guide for 2023 is out. It is also posted on our website, and we have a whole listing of some of those different soil applied products that you can use. Table 1 shows us all the pre-emergence products we can use in corn, and Table 2 shows us all the ones we can use in soybeans. And there are several available, and it's really important to know what weeds you're trying to control to pick those appropriate pre-emergence herbicides. Just a quick thing on winter wheat, a couple of things. These are the picture that's up here is some of the wheat that we have planted this year. You can see there's a lot of chickweed coming up. We've also seen some whitlow grass, some mare's tail. So these are going to need to be controlled in the next couple of weeks. Couple things to keep in mind when you're getting ready to put your herbicides on your wheat, make sure those both the weeds and the wheat are actively growing. We're starting to see that green up. It'll be pretty quick before we're able to go ahead and make those herbicide applications. One of the things we do want to make sure that we stress is not to apply the herbicides to the crops under stress. A good rule of thumb also is to make sure that we're applying those herbicides when the daily temperature is 50 degrees or higher. One of the things that we do know when we apply herbicides when the temperatures are cooler, particularly with some of the group 2 herbicides, those ALS inhibitors, we can see some pretty significant injury. This is a picture from a couple of years ago. You can see some strips that are highlighted that are yellow, stunted compared to the rest of the strips. And many of these were applied when the temperature was below 50 degrees. So it's important to make sure that we do that when we're making the those applications in wheat. Couple other things to consider, weed growth stage and size, as well as the weeds that you're trying to control. In this picture, we have a planting of wheat that we had where we planted on September 23rd versus October 24th. These are side by side, and you can tell the differences in tillering and so forth from just waiting a month for that application. And again, these pictures were taken about 2 days ago. A couple other things to consider. If you have frost-seeded red clover, we're pretty much the only herbicides that we can use in the spring this year would be MCPA, as well as axial bold for grass control. So just keep that in mind. And finally, with potentially some of the rain coming in, some of that nitrogen may be wanting to be put on a little bit later with those herbicide applications. Remember, there are some guidelines to that. Many times we're not wanting to use 100% of the carrier volume as 28%. And we do have some very good guidelines for many of these questions in our MSU Weed Control Guide. And finally, just wanted to touch quickly on cover crop termination options. We have a lot of cereal rye that's out there. There's a lot of mixtures. Some of those might have clover. We do have a very good cover crop termination guide that Dr. Erin Hill and myself put together a few years ago. We'll put this web link in the chat for those of you online. Basically, if you just look up MSU cover crop termination, it'll take you to a resource page and you can download that. And it talks about the different herbicides that you can use for terminating some of these different cover crops. And finally, just a few take-home messages. As we start thinking about early season weed control, it's really important to be prepared with a comprehensive weed management plan. And make sure you're considering the potential for some of those herbicide-resistant weeds. This is really important as we start to see water hemp move throughout the state. With this early season weed control, it's really important to start clean so we don't start out on a bad foot, and make sure we are able to reach our maximum yield potential. And remember, those pre-emergence herbicides are going to be really important to make sure we reduce that weed pressure and put less pressure on those post-herbicides. For wheat, consider the temperature when you're making those applications, growth stages, and several of those other factors that you should consider. And many of those guidelines are listed in our weed control guide. And then with the cover crop termination, make sure that you're making those applications very timely. We have up here the MSU Weed Control Guide that is available through the MSU bookstore or MSU e-bookstore. And also we have it online at our website, msuweeds.com, and we'll put both of those in the chat. So with that, thank you very much. And I will turn it over to, I guess, Eric or Jeff.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Christy. All right, so we've got a handful of questions already in the chat, and a lot of them have been for Christy so far, and Christy's been really good about answering them in the chat. But for those who are joining by phone or aren't reading the chat, I'm just going to read those, and then Christy, you can kind of give a whatever summary you want for that. So the first question had to do with a particular herbicide. Should osprey or can osprey be used in wheat with frost-seeded clover?
So for a spring application, no, that will kill the clover. So if you're looking for a grass option, that would be axial bold. If you have broadleafs out there, it would be MCPA if you have frost-seeded clover.
Okay. And a question about early planted soybean. What do you think of delayed pre-emergence herbicide applications on early planted soybean? Are there any specific herbicides to use or to avoid in that scenario?
So with early planted soybean, we really started looking at that this last year for delayed pre-applications, like using something like a Sharpen or a Valor or some of the Authority products. Any of those ones that would potentially kill or injure the soybeans if they're starting to come up, it gets a little tricky. So we were trying to time it on growing degree days. We had some instances where we did get some injury. The herbicides that would probably not be a problem would be some of your group 15s, like a dual warrant Outlook, Zidua that could be applied. Just remember, those aren't going to provide foliar activity. So you would, if you had some weeds coming up, you may need to mix it with something with like a glyphosate if you're trying to control those weeds. So it's kind of a hit and miss. We were again trying for 80 growing degree days, which ended up being about 2 weeks last year, and we did have some injury with some of those ones that would potentially cause injury as the soybeans come up.
Before I forget, and while this is still on the screen, I just want to let everyone know that throughout the growing season, if you happen to miss one of the virtual breakfasts, but you still want to catch the content, they are all recorded, and you can check out at any of these sites here. Also on our team's webpage, the recordings will be posted later on in that same week. Can't get credits for viewing the recordings, but you can definitely catch the content. Had another question come in about the weed control guide, specifically about is there information about horse pastures? And Christy said yes, there definitely is for hay and pasture ground. Let's see. So this question, and the person who put it in, if we're not covering exactly what you're talking about, go ahead and clarify. But the question was, what's the best for cover crop termination if the goal is improving nitrogen deficient soil? So some kind of a legume.
Yeah, so I think from that, I'm thinking that you're wanting to make sure that you incorporate that cover into the soil to make sure that you're getting the full aspect of, if you have a legume there versus, terminating it, leaving it on the surface. I think an incorporation would be a best way to make sure you're getting those nutrients into the soil.
Okay. Another question. So you talked a little bit about air temperatures for herbicide applications, and one of the questions was how long do the temps need to be 50 and above for wheat? Is that a day or 24 hours?
Yeah, so I think, and I answered a day before and a day after, not saying that the temperatures can't go below that. The one thing you need to be cautious of is if you've got temperatures that are going, in your low 30s, that's when you have problems. So if you're fluctuating between, somewhere in the 40s to 50s, like night temperatures, you're probably okay. You just don't want them to hit the lows. And that's where you really start to see some issues.
So I just looked at least in southern Michigan, I looked at the outlook here for the coming 10 days, and Sunday through Tuesday, we're looking at, lows in the 40s or above and highs, up to 60, like Jeff said. So Sunday through Tuesday looks like a good opportunity.
Yes, that would be a good opportunity. Again, just make sure you're in an area where your weeds are starting to, everything's starting to green up. So probably further to the north, that may not be the case.
Mm-hmm. So here's something that I actually hadn't thought of before. I just checked our soil temperatures are kind of in the low to mid 40s at the 4-inch, and at 2-inch even starting to get close to 50. Is that even something that growers need to be looking at, is soil temperature when they're putting down a pre-emerge, or does that really have nothing to do with it?
Soil temperature for the pre-emerge probably is not going to affect how that pre-emergence herbicide works. We had done some stuff on some late fall applications before and had those residuals work well. So soil temperature probably would not have an effect on a pre.
Okay.
And if I could just add a reminder too, this time of the year especially, those mild, somewhat surprisingly mild temperatures, a lot of that has to do with sunshine. And we've had some very, very sunny days. If we are warm but cloudy, you won't see the same response. And they'll be cooler than they would be otherwise. So it's this time of the year you can really see a difference when you've got full sun, like we have in a lot of the last week.
This next one I think is for Jeff. Sometimes I think people see all the different charts and graphs and information that you share, and they wonder, are those secret? Are those meteorologists, little treasure troves that we don't get access to? So the question is there a good place for us, the public, to go on and see that weather information?
Yeah, Jeff, we need the special handshake.
Yeah, the secret crystal ball or the lucky rabbit's foot. There are some of these actually. Most of everything that I show is public domain, and so it's sort of strange to the question, because I was hoping next week to actually have actually list some of the sites that I use, and I'll share that next week. So yes, these are publicly available. Now that said, there also are, with the commercial meteorological sector, there's a large number of products, and some of you probably have that or have access to that you can subscribe to and get additional types of information. But the ones I use, I rely strongly on the National Weather Service, which of course is all public information. So it may seem like secrets sometimes, but they have to share it if and you can find it. And I'll try to share some of those sites. So it's a good question as we start the season here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. This question about the soil sampling is very timely. This person is wondering if MSU Extension offices are performing soil sample testing. They contacted a company and they're just having a hard time. So again, very timely question because, as most of you know, the MSU Soils Lab closed down at the end of 22. And so there's a team of MSU Extension folks who are working a lot over the last 9 months or so to try to get us through a transition period. And that is starting this coming Monday. So in your extension offices, starting Monday, April 3rd, you'll be able to purchase soil testing kits, both for home and garden and for field crops. It should look fairly seamless to you, and in fact, it might even be a little bit better than before, but it'll look really similar. And so starting on April 3rd, go ahead and visit your local extension office, and they can sell you one of those. And then they'll tell you a little bit about some of the information that you need to supply to them. Just an FYI, what we'll be doing is all those soil samples will get sent to A&L labs down in Fort Wayne. They'll be doing the testing, but then they'll be sending it back to MSU for Michigan-centric recommendations. Let's see, more questions. Has anyone at MSU done sampling or found aluminum from chemtrails? I'm not sure if anyone's on the call who's feels like they got a good handle on that question.
That might be trials, Eric.
Chemtrails. All right. I'm not sure if we have Kurt or one of our soil folks on here. Let's see. How will the 700 plus inch snowpacks in Utah affect weather going forward?
And I'm just actually typing a response, but I'll save I wasn't quite done with it. As most of you know and appreciate, just been an incredible reversal in water conditions in the western U.S. And besides Utah, certainly much of the West has had well above normal precip, and snowpack in some cases is actually at an all-time record in portions of California. But a couple of major issues with that. I think one of the big take homes is that this will not end the long-term dryness. That's a little bit of on the negative side. However, for the upcoming growing season, it has completely changed things, especially in California, but for much of the West that relies so heavily on surface water, reservoirs, et cetera, and recharge. So there were many restrictions last year for agriculture and for water rights, water allotments, that caused major changes and major problems last year. That is almost, you'd never say never, but very unlikely this year. So the biggest, I think, impact of all of this water, besides the damage, and of course there's that too, but is that there will probably be almost full water allotments for most growers. So crops that were not planted last year because of that, the shortages, that's at least for the foreseeable future not an issue. So big change there, and for much of the West, but it doesn't end what has been several years of near record-breaking dryness. So that will take longer. It would take longer to get out of that, but it's certainly for the short term and the medium term. It's a big turnaround.
Okay. I've got a cover crop termination question, Christy. So for those folks who like to leave their cover crops a little bit longer in the spring, get a little bit more growth with what appears to be a little bit earlier warm up. You mentioned a little bit about cover crop termination and timing. Is there anything unique to this spring that people just keep in mind about getting that burn down on the cover crop if they're wanting to, let's say, leave it on a little bit longer?
I think a lot of it really depends on what the cover crop is. Some of those are a little bit easier to terminate than others. So something like a ryegrass is probably a little bit more difficult to terminate. So, you want to make sure that that's growing actively, and you don't want it to get too big. There's a lot of people that get gun shy with cereal rye, but we've actually had very good luck terminating cereal rye just with glyphosate at equivalent to be like 1.13 pounds acid equivalent, which would be 32 ounces of the old Roundup Power Max. So with that, we went all the way up to flowering of cereal rye and have done a lot of planting green, just terminating it with straight glyphosate, and have had some pretty good luck. So it just really depends on what the cover is. Some of them are more difficult. Some of the clovers and stuff might be a little bit more difficult. So just it's going to depend on the cover.
Okay. Here's kind of a fun question. So this person said, I know weeds in a garden or farm are considered a pest. Are there any weeds that are actually helpful in a farm or garden situation? So the definition of what's a weed, are there anything that are beneficial for us?
Yeah, so I was reading that question, trying to think of a really good answer, because I always think of them, as a weed scientist. There are some virtues to some of those weeds. A lot of it depends on what you want to use it for, right? I mean, we've got a lot of winter annuals out there that could provide some soil stability, kind of as a cover during the winter. So some of those, you could think of those almost as like a cover crop. The ones that you get a little bit nervous about are ones that can produce a lot of seed and, spread widely. So, I would think maybe some of those winter annuals might be helpful as far as acting as more of a cover. And it just really depends on what you want. There's some weeds that have some pretty favorable flowers, but it just depends on if you can help manage those. So, yeah, it is a fun question. I don't know if I have any really good answers. Maybe that's what I should say.
I've heard that for henbit or purple dead nettle, you see those blankets of purple out there, and people have wondered, well, why would I plant a cover crop? I've got a natural cover crop. Is there any precautions that you would have about that?
I think the precautions is that some of those would, maybe be an alternate host for something like a soybean cyst nematode. So, if it's in a field and you're growing soybeans and that's a concern, that would be one of them. I guess, from a fun note, there are different weeds that can act as indicators for different issues with your soils. So some weeds will only grow in high pH soils. Some will grow where soils are compacted. So they can be good indicators. And several years ago, Dr. Karen Renner and myself, as well as a few others, put together these integrated weed management books, and there was a nice table in there. Oh, there's a nice one. Milkweed for butterflies. Yep, that's another good option.
All right.
Thank you, David.
We don't have any more questions in the chat right now. We do have one answer from one of our previous questions about that aluminum toxicity. Mike Staten, our soybean educator, says aluminum toxicity can occur in very acidic soils, and by acidic mean down below 5.0. Before we jump off here, I want to find if there are other specialists or educators who are on this morning. Have you got anything to share? I saw Marty was on. I'm not sure if Dennis is on. Any other specialists have anything they want to share with us this morning? All right, I will take that as a no. All right, well, thanks for joining again, everyone. Like Jeff said, next week we've got Dr. Kurt Steinke talking about some early season soil fertility in corn, soy, and wheat. So be sure to come back and join us for that. With that, everyone have a great Thursday. We'll see you back next week.